Sean, you've called this work a poetic inquiry into place, politics and class intertwined with personal histories. That's quite a lot to pack into this space. Can you tell me how you went about drawing out these specific stories that relate to Venice, but also to your own story?
Yeah, sure. I think the body work really follows on from a project that I did about 7 years ago called Melfa, which was the first kind of attempt really that I began to think about a sense of autobiography in my own work, and that was centred around a shopping centre in Llaned, in the council estate that I grew up on. And I really wanted to think about how this kind of building, its formality, maybe had a relationship to my visual language that I'd been generating. And so I wanted to kind of revisit that work and think about how one might be able to create sculpture that engaged with some of those ideas. Particularly, there's kind of a quite healthy discussion at the moment around kind of working class voices within culture, particularly kind of literature and theatre and film. And I kind of started to think about how does that translate into art, and how does that translate as a visual language. And the bodywork really, I had a kind of two phrases that I was thinking about quite a lot. One was this phrase of not expecting much, that I was thinking about as a way of living for a kind of great deal of the population in Wales, the UK, but kind of globally. And also an idea of a most honest version of yourself, which is a Fassbinder quote that I came through Moira Davey, the Canadian artist. And how, by putting the most honest version of yourself into a work, you might create a great resonance for the viewer. And so I kind of wanted to think about how those things could combine with all these ideas of politics, kind of poetics and place, to create something that wasn't overtly political, but maybe kind of had a political edge with a small p in the work and was treated formally.
Can you talk us through this sculpture that's surrounding you at the minute? Because this, you said, wasn't actually in your original proposal. How did this manifest itself? Yeah,
I think the proposal very much spoke about these ideas of the most honest version of myself and creating a body work. I mean, my practice generally is kind of really thinking around how different materials are kind of drawn down, whether that's kind of visual material, audio material, kind of research from different archives, how that's drawn down, and then kind of through the process of a studio activity becomes a work. So the proposal was very much about these ideas of politics, class, personal histories, and trying to kind of readdress those. I thought it would become a film because it was following on from Melfa. I saw it almost as a kind of continuation of that. But in the process of making it and working with those materials, I became quite interested in how they had potential sculptural properties. And then equally in the space, I very much wanted the space to be a character in this suite of works. And the moment you begin to make film, you start to shut down the light in the spaces and kind of hide things. And we want to kind of make everything kind of visible in a way. So I think I began to think about, when I approach making sculpture, I approach it as something that has time inherently bound up in it, as it's kind of an experience of making, but also an experience of viewing. Similarly, when I make video, I think about how that can have a physical sensation to do with kind of sculpture. So I can very much, whilst this is an object, an installation, it uses properties of film, of tracking, of moving through, of images coalescing and coming together. So they're kind of essentially a number of collages that have been trimmed down to make a three-dimensional collage that you then as the viewer reassemble almost as kind of like film fragments and produce the film yourself.
There's a real sense of boundary though with this metal grid and these sticks of MDF, is it?
Yeah, they're laminated MDF, so kind of UV printed images and then kind of laminated different sheets of MDF with kind of hand-drawn elements to them. And the estate where I grew up on there's a large kind of council estate on the outskirts of Cardiff, and within that estate there were a number of smaller estates, and each of these estates was kind of bracketed by kind of small woodlands. And so this kind of sense of boundary was kind of formative in the kind of years of growing up as you then moved to these woodlands. And that was one of the things that was in the kind of proposal quite early on, was about kind of moving through things, creating boundaries, blocking the viewer. This, again, kind of an idea of the confessional, kind of a shared experience, an intimate moment, personal, private, public, all of these things kind of intertwined. And so this kind of idea of a boundary with this was kind of something I was thinking about.
But you're also drawing on your experience of growing up as a Catholic child as well, and hours spent in church.
Yeah, very
which as a
much
child
so.
is always felt keenly, isn't it, that restraint?
This is it, and the kind of ritual of
Repetition.
that, and the kind of the repetition of that. And my mother was brought up in a Catholic children's home, so for her that was nuns kind of raised her essentially. So that idea of ritual is kind of very much ingrained in her way of being. So we had it through church, but equally kind of in the home there was a sense of kind of ritual and experience as well. But yeah, I've for a long time, I think, as well as kind of thinking about how my visual language over 15 years or so has been mainly informed by kind of class histories and things like that, I think equally I consider that Catholic upbringing and that kind of inherent belief in kind of moments of transubstantiation in kind of Catholic Mass, of some physical object becoming another physical object through an experience. And that's something that has always kind of been at the kind of heart of the making of exhibitions, really, is how these things in the studio, bits of MDF, bits of steel, how they actually communicate and become something else when experienced with a viewer in front of them.
Behind us there's screens that you've called confessional screens, but they utilise a very famous British newspaper typography. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they're called newspaper, which is struck through confessional, and yeah, they use a pattern that's lifted from the masthead of the Sun newspaper, a right-wing kind of tabloid newspaper in the UK. It's kind of quite infamous for a number of different things. And it's come from a bodywork that, again, I've been making for quite a large period of time. It was probably the first, it kind of predated Mouth, was kind of probably the first moment that politics kind of slipped into the work kind of overtly. And that was where I was buying the Sun newspaper every day. It was a banned newspaper in my household. My paternal grandparents were from a mining community that moved to Cardiff, and they were kind of staunch trade unionists. So the Daily Mirror, the left kind of leaning tabloid newspaper, was what we read, and the Sun was not to kind of grace the household. And I kind of started to think about that as an illicit activity when I kind of started to buy this newspaper, to collate these uns, to cut out this kind of abstraction. So the S was removed, and this un as a kind of a repetition kind of was collaged. So this un, this kind of almost stutter in this fixed moment. To try and think about a kind of a formality of politics maybe in the work that I could do. It was also at the point where the kind of Conservative supporting Sun was supporting Labour. It was Tony Blair's Labour. And so there was a kind of a merging of right and left, or right to centre politics, and I was kind of interested in that as well as something. And so wanted to kind of revisit that for this work, because it was this kind of political starting point. It is something that is inherently bound up in class, I think, the Sun newspaper. Bound up in kind of many issues that we're dealing with today, Brexit and things like that. But equally becomes something about that idea of a confessional in relation to Catholicism, and the private confessional, and then the confession in relation to kind of tabloid journalism and the kind of public confessional and the tell-all and things like that.
I believe there's a radio play that is part of the show at 2 o'clock every afternoon, is that right?
So every day at 2 o'clock, my mother, we're calling it a radio play. It's a live radio play, so it's a piece of theatre, which is really important for me. So for the duration of the Biennale, at 2 p.m. every day, my mother performs from Cardiff, from the council flat in Cardiff. She performs a play that I've written, 20-minute play, that is transmitted into the Biennale, into this exhibition, and yeah, kind of transforms the space that moment. So the speakers sit around the space through the exhibition. There's this kind of absence of the sounds that you feel for most of the day, but then at this small moment at 2 o'clock, this voice that is a voice that isn't generally heard. Again, think about these ideas of whose voice is made present in these types of scenarios. It's not the voice that has ever made a public address before and is now kind of performing daily for a 7-month period. And stories, the script is composed of stories of actually her voice, her tale, kind of recollections of cleaning the home. They used to clean the kind of corridors, so recollections of that, how that then carries through into her work as a cleaner when she kind of left the home and had to get work. also kind of then recollections of her leaving the home and kind of, you know, what it means for children in care to leave homes, or to kind of be thrown out into the streets, essentially. And then equally, there's kind of recollections that I've made of kind of growing up, and pieces of found kind of text that I've used in the play as well.
He remembers a damp basement flat. There was a yellow budgie. We weren't here too long before moving to a council flat in the sky. When his sister was born, we moved to the home that I lived in for 30 years. The longest I have remained at one address. We drive past it now, and its new residents do not keep it clean. There's rubbish all around the gate, out the back. I keep a clean home. Cleaning? Oh, there was a lot of that, I do remember. Waxing and polishing floors, scrubbing. Another thing I do remember, being up in it was a big long corridor. It was really, really long. We used to scrub it on our hands and knees with scrubbing brushes and floor cloths. There would be
You've also managed to bring your father into the space. Tell us a little bit about the video that's in the next room.
Yeah, so again, in this kind of way of autobiographies, kind of, you know, the mother and father are kind of obviously very important. The film Doms is kind of really kind of recollecting something, kind of moments when my father used to visit and would play dominoes with my grandfather, and from the kind of other room you would hear the sound of the shuffling of the dominoes, and I kind of wanted to really kind of try and find a way of kind of making a visual version of that in some ways. So it's a 16mm film that's been transferred to digital. You think there's a kind of 3-minute, you know, just under 3-minute film that you watch and then it loops, but actually it's 2 films that are kind of spliced together of a clockwise rotation of the shuffling and an anti-clockwise rotation of the shuffling. So there's a sense of repetition, of back and forth and rhythm that occurs in the domino shuffling, but also the films playing together. And really starting to kind of draw upon ideas of gambling and addiction and things like that as well.
And lastly, the quilts in the very final room are sort of beautiful objects, but they came back through a residency, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's meant to be a year-long residency. I've probably been doing it for 2 years, and I think once this finishes, I'm going to go back there. They're just not going to get rid of me. At a space called St Fagans, which is part of the National Museum of Wales, and it's kind of a museum of Welsh life. And one of the things that became really interesting there was the kind of Welsh whole cloth quilts that they have. I've previously made a small artist publication with a group of Welsh quilters in a place called Gilfachroch. Kind of some ladies that used to meet on a Wednesday and make these quilts together. And then kind of finding these quilts again in the St Fagans collection kind of, you know, re-sparked my interest in things to do with kind of the daily ritual. The way the quilts were made, the kind of different uses of them made as kind of heirlooms, as kind of marriage quilts that might be handed over. The kind of historic idea of the kind of itinerant quilters, women who would travel around to different homes making these quilts of people, and then also the kind of the women that would make them at home themselves with their daughters and things like this. And the kind of traditional way of making is the patterns that would be kind of on those quilts were often, you know, kind of spirals and things that they would use everyday objects to kind of produce those circles and shapes, you know, cups, wine glasses, and I want to kind of think about that every day, tying it in with these ideas of the kind of everyday of the newspaper and using the motifs of the sun and the Daily Mirror to create my own versions of quilting patterns. So I worked with, made the designs, then worked with 2 kind of quilters based in Wales, Samantha Jones and Karen Coxedge, to kind of produce the 3 quilts in the show.
And the colours are very specific, aren't they, that you've used on the quilts?
Yeah, so there's the colours, so kind of one of the key things about the Welsh whole cloth quilt is that they are whole cloth, they're not patchwork. American quilts are patchwork. Often in the north of England, the quilts are kind of, you know, the quilting is hidden because of the patchwork thing, but the Welsh, the big thing is that they are monochromes. So the pattern is made by the quilting. And so I wanted to kind of keep that as a kind of an important aspect of it and also make some kind of versions of monochrome paintings. But then to kind of talk to the colours that some of the quilts in St Fagans had, kind of even though they're historical, there's an amazing kind of contemporary feeling to some of the colours. But also there was kind of thinking about the contemporary colour of sleeping bags and that kind of image that is kind of too kind of present really in the kind of streets of, you know, most of the UK, but very particularly in Cardiff. I've returned back to Cardiff after a period of living in a kind of a small market town called Abergavenny, and in the period of me leaving Cardiff to me kind of returning to Cardiff, there's kind of return to a Cardiff that I remember from my kind of childhood when kind of Thatcher was in power. Yeah.
Now that you've seen this project you've been working on for the last 2 years, is it?
No, 9 months pretty much. I mean, about a year ago we found out.
What are the aspects that are particularly pleasing or kind of exciting to you about seeing it all installed?
I think about the work coming together with the space. I mean, particularly this kind of installation here. You know, there's kind of producing the work. You're very much aware of the space that you're making it to. It's always kind of a key part for me, is that the two works kind of better together, and so the way we kind of made these sculptures was to have a relationship to the images in the church, the colours in the church. But I think you can't really fully get that until you install it and fully see here. I mean, this is the first time this is able to be installed, you know, to the scale in the studio. We couldn't put it up like this. So that kind of the coming together of everything has kind of really been kind of a key thing for me, and kind of being able to move around this and experience it as this kind of time-based sculpture that I was hoping it would do.
It's a really rich and interesting piece.
Thank you. Thank you.